Hello, you. Owen Lloyd-Williams here, and thank you so much for joining my MeasureFest talk at this autumn's Brighton SEO. I currently work for a company called iTech Media in a freelance consulting basis under the name Son of Jack Limited. And today I'm going to be talking to you about what fantasy football taught me about building nuanced SEO reports. Now, you're probably thinking straight off the bat, fantasy football, SEO reports, where's the connection there? That's a bit tenuous. And yes, it is very tenuous. You are right. Tenuousness is a theme that runs throughout the course of this presentation. However, bear with me. There's a nice, fun, good old-fashioned lockdown story behind all of this, whereby I got very bored, did one thing of fantasy football stats, and then eventually, hopefully, turned it into something that could be useful for you. That being in the form of SEO reporting templates, SEO reporting formulas for Excel, and just ways in which we perhaps think about our reporting in the frames of 2021 with automation and everything else at the moment. But first of all, a little bit about me, the inevitable self-indulgent look at me slide. Not too much to say here, a number of brands that I worked with over the years, been in the game 10 years or so. As I said, I'm currently freelancing, but working at iTech Media on a full-time basis. Shout out to you guys, love you guys, and we'll move on. In my free time, I also curate a very niche 90s ambient shoegazing solo music project. So this is on my personal website, and I promise this is the last plug I'll do throughout the course of this presentation, despite the fact that my name's on every single slide. But if you're interested in that kind of noise from the early 90s, that kind of ambient stuff, then do have a little look on my website. And finally, I have also over the years curated somewhat of a niche specialism in China SEO or Baidu SEO, owing to living out there for 5 years in a previous life and writing a number of guides for agencies, some of which may be a bit out of date now, but if you ever want to kind of learn about SEO in China or how to do SEO in China, then do have a look. I also maintain a bit of a blog space on this too, if you kind of want to see what's going on in 2021 with China SEO. But we're not going to talk about any of this. Back to it then. Paint the scene. March 2020, the pandemic hits the shores of the UK, or at least wider Europe, and things go into lockdown. I got very, very bored. Many of us got very, very bored. Here's a story I hope you can relate to in some respect. However, instead of doing something productive, let's say like knitting, I waited for the football to start, and I started to do this. I think football started in June, July that year at some point with no fans. But basically, I started extracting manually into a Google Sheet weekly statistics on every player that I had in my fantasy football team. And it literally became the highlight of my week. Incidentally, it coincided with a manual reporting exercise I had to do for a particularly tricky stakeholder at that time. More on that later. But as you can see here, I went into my fantasy football team every week, looked at the points they've got, what team they played for, how many times I picked them, how many minutes they've played, what their nationality was, total points, goals scored, assists, the list goes on. And I ended up with something like this, a huge data sheet with loads and loads of stats, numbers on all individual players, what their total points were, how many goals they scored, etc., throughout the whole course of the season. And I thought, well, what better to do with a data sheet like this than put it into a pivot chart? I mean, we're SEOs, right? That's what we do. And interestingly, I started thinking, oh, there's some interesting numbers here. And caveat on this particular slide, where I've shown you how many the amount of times I picked nationalities, I've removed England because it looks very Brexity. No, that's not the real reason. I removed it because obviously it's a Premier League and that skews the numbers of English players and it just makes the chart look a bit silly. But as you can see here, Northern Ireland leading the way, that's one player. And sorry, Colombia, that was an experiment gone wrong with James Rodriguez. But I started doing other data points as well. Here you can see nationalities picked and points that those nationalities returned. Some interesting stats here. Egypt, I wonder who that could be. Sorry again, Colombia. Northern Ireland doing very well there. Again, it was one player routinely throughout the course of the season I just had in my team. Then I went a bit further. Who's seen charts like this before? Plotting on opposite axes, 3 different metrics, average points per game, top players picked versus cost. It's not really telling me anything, but still there's some interesting stats in there. Again, here's another slide that looks like something similar where I've got player names, points they gave me, and how much they cost. Interesting? Well, not really, until I thought, well, I think the world wants to hear about this. Let's put it on Twitter in a form of a shouting into the abyss Twitter thread, where I literally built out about 15 or 16 pivot tables for all that data, which nobody paid attention to, but that's fine. It was at this point that I felt very sad, and I thought, what the hell is the point of all this? I spent all this time doing all this data pulling and getting things together, and it's got this data set that's in some way is interesting, but maybe not. But with me, I'm glad that worked. I thought, well, what if I start equating these fancy football stats and moving over the metrics, let's say minutes played, goals scored, etc., and start thinking about how this could look with regards to SEO metrics and build some nuanced data reports out of it. So for example, let's say Manchester City, they're a team. Let's say that they are a small e-commerce website, not a team. And the amount of goals they score that season are converted into how many conversions they got via the organic channel. Tenuous? Yeah, maybe, but I had to do something with this data anyway. Moving on, Mohamed Salah. Let's say that the amount of minutes played by Mohamed Salah counted for the amount of indexed pages on the Liverpool website. There's no way that Mohamed Salah played 49,700 minutes, but that was the kind of closest thing I could get to with minutes played metrics translating something from SEO metrics. I'm sure there's many more we could think of. Or even, and bear with me here, look at row number 4, Son for Spurs. Son is a keyword, Spurs is a keyword bucket. Son ranks in position 30, and the URL he ranks for is his nationality, South Korea. Over that particular period of time, Son got us 228 visits from that keyword and got us 13 goals. Isn't that great? Now you're probably thinking tenuous, and you're probably right. In fact, you are right. However, this is the only way I could kind of, build out nuanced SEO reports from these football stats and equate them accordingly. And so I ended up with this 3 or maybe 4 or even 5 individual templates, SEO reporting templates that pulled in stats from all different areas of SEO that could be useful, that, we'll get to a point later on as to why this could help us with our work and with our reporting. So number 1, crawl stats, keywords, ranked, and traffic. There's some other metrics in there as well. Big caveat, these are all dummy numbers, but this is one reporting template I ended up with that we could perhaps pivot some data from. Number 2, technical issues, traffic, and keywords. We're getting further and further away from the football metrics, but you can see what links there are perhaps, at least in making a template for SEO reporting. And number 3, traffic, keywords, conversions. And finally, keywords and e-commerce forecasting. Again, you can see here what I'm doing is I'm pulling all these usual normal SEO metrics that we have to contend with on a day-to-day basis that we might get from a variety of individual sources and putting them into one place. Perhaps you'll see a theme emerging here. And so going back to one particular report, the first one where I equated player name, total points, minutes played, clean sheets, goals, into these things, a number of indexation-based metrics and concurrent traffic and keyword ranking based metrics. A lot of this data you can get in Google Search Console, but obviously you have to kind of look around elsewhere as well from Google Search itself, your sitemap data, as well as obviously your keyword and ranking traffic. And this became something that looked like this. Another big chart, loads of numbers on, big caveat, these are dummy numbers, but then we can start building these pivot tables again out of them and start getting some views on pages in sitemaps, pages indexed on Google Search Console, and pages indexed on site search to maybe assess differences in indexation for different sources, which is something that we often don't, we don't have access to, particularly in one particular tool. Moving on a bit further, flipping on its head somewhat, how is that indexation disparity affecting our traffic? Well, one potential chart where we could crunch numbers and gain some insights. Report number 2, technical issues, traffic, keywords, and goals, where I equated these metrics into these metrics, one from fantasy football, one from SEO, and I went around the houses from these data sources, pulling all that in from a dummy website, Google Search Console, SEO Monitor for keyword rankings, Ahrefs for traffic and technical SEO issues, and Google Analytics for traffic, and so on and so on and so on, and ended up with something like this, where I ended up pivoting where something like this came about, where we had a look on total keywords ranked, how they were converting, and what the urgent technical issues were. This is an interesting one because you can see here that Harry Kane, who has the most keywords ranked, also has the most amount of technical SEO issues as well. So maybe there's something in that about quality of traffic and low conversion metrics. Edison doing very well there in his keywords ranked conversion ratio in the middle. Moving on to report number 3, which was a forecasting reporting template. Again, taking the familiar fantasy football metrics, equating them with some familiar SEO and reporting forecasting metrics based around keywords and traffic and forecasting traffic and so on. Again, all dummy numbers here, but this is what the report looked like, where I basically assumed in the columns in green that after, let's say, a link building campaign or a content marketing campaign, we started looking at forecasted traffic and forecasted goals based on current ranking scenarios. That's down to you to crunch. But hey, this is what it could end up looking like, where we've got a number of goals from one particular keyword, projected ranks after amount of time, after that particular content marketing is done, and then forecasted goals. This probably doesn't look quite right because I've just literally used dummy numbers, but you get the idea. And it occurred to me that maybe my story of manually exporting fantasy football stats into a sheet and transferring those into SEO metrics wasn't such a daft thing at all, because it is something that we do on a regular basis. As I said, going around the houses, tool number 1, tool number 2, always setting up these dashboards on these tools, but never quite getting to the data we want, so having to export it into a various different Excel sheets and putting that into pivot tables and presenting it and so on. It takes time. Basically, it looks something like this. There's a lot of chaos going in here. Let's take an example. So copying data, pasting over, deduping, pivoting, using VLOOKUPs to crunch this data, find this data, and get it all into one master place. There is a solution to this, and it's something that I think has kind of fallen by the wayside in recent years with all the talk around automation and Python and scripting and so on. It is SEO tools for Excel. It's still a really, really good tool that we can use out there that does pull in APIs from a lot of these tools that I've mentioned. So you can see there, you've got analytics. There's also Majestic and Screaming Frog as well. It does a lot of that for us. And I think it's something that we can maybe consider a bit more in this age of automation. Anyway, moving on to a next tangible point, hopefully tangible point of this presentation, formulas. So this is Excel formulas that I discovered or kind of, fell in love with again over the course of using these fantasy football templates and turning them into SEO reporting templates, where I was dealing with multiple spreadsheets and wanted to find data and pivot accordingly. First up is offset. Now, offset is a pretty straightforward Excel formula for SEO work and reporting work, but it's incredibly useful when we're exporting data from tools like Google Analytics in this particular instance, and we want to look at compared date ranges for one particular metric. So here we've got our keywords, which are players. We've got date range, got 2 different date ranges here over 2 different weeks. We want to look at the users and compare how the keywords brought in users over the 2 different date range. Annoyingly, here's what we get when we export it in Google Analytics, but offset will help us separate that using that formula into the week 1 and week 2, so we can easily get the data side by side and not in one row, which is a lot more useful. Huge kudos to the guys at Distilled who have written an article some time ago, a number of SEO formulas for Excel that I'd recommend you go read. Number 2, extracting data from subfolders. Let's say we've got a huge list of URLs from one particular crawl. Let's assume that the crawl is our team, and that team is Tottenham Hotspur, and that's our website, which it is. You can see there the domain. And we want to look at a cross view about, performance, whether it's conversions, traffic, keywords ranked, or whatever technical SEO issues bucketed across different subfolders of the site. Now, there's a really good formula for that, which can end up looking like something like this. I'm sure there's a joke here about the conversion rate being 0% for these Spurs players, but I won't entertain that. Here's what the formula looks like. Write that down in your copybook now. Again, huge thanks to these guys. Builders are all old friends of mine, but they've got equally brilliant SEO formula for SEOs article with tons of stuff, which we should all still be using in this day and age. Finally, if ISNA VLOOKUP, this is basically an advanced form of VLOOKUP where As you may have already seen, we're dealing with a number of different reporting sheets or Excel sheets or Google Sheets, whatever it is, from various different data sources. And we want to start looking and see if we can match data from those sheets and start having to jump around and copy and paste and so on. So let's pose the question, do these reporting templates contain the same domain URL that I can cross-reference in one sheet? Or maybe that's for, traffic to that particular URL or rankings to that URL, whatever it might be. And here's the formula in question. Write that down in your copybooks now. And here's what it might look like. So we've got a website. We've got the question, is it in template 2? If yes, it returns the name. If no, it's not found. And we can start to cross and compare data from different data sources that might be missed in one particular template. And that can be really, really useful. Which brings me on to the final point of my talk, the need for manual reporting in 2021, and how this exercise from exporting manual fantasy football stats and turning it into SEO reports helped me with what I wanted to do, helped me find new reporting templates, new formulas, and why we still need to think about this in 2021. Firstly, I think it helps us contextualize SEO issues better. I think there's a big reliance, and there's some really, really good tools out there that do a lot of work for us, automated dashboards, whether that's an SEO suite tool, like let's say, BrightEdge or DeepCrawl or SEMrush, where we've got all that data there and it's all for us, and it's numbers and it's templates. But there can be an over-reliance on that, where it doesn't necessarily drill into what was really important. For example, a report like this, and guys at AHS, I love you very much. This has been in no way, shape or form, or any kind of offense to your wonderful, wonderful tool, but it's just an example. This doesn't necessarily tell us an awful lot about the situation on the site and what we can do to actually improve things on a tangible commercial basis. Yes, those are issues that need to be fixed. And yes, I'm sure if some CMO or someone without an SEO mind sees this, they might freak out. But it doesn't tell us much in terms of the actual tangible improvements we should be making on the site. We need that data that we need in front of us to go through on a day-to-day basis to understand what the actual situation is and what the numbers are in terms of, let's say, conversion potential or keyword rankings to actually make such changes on this site to help us improve. Next point, limitless potential. Now, templates are indeed templates. There's nothing wrong with that. Again, we're talking about automation here and kind of SEO suites and the tendency just to have everything combined with one particular template. That's fine. And often they do cover the most important metrics. So here we've got things like, new lost links, clicks, impressions, GSC data being pulled in, rankings being pulled in. That's perfect. But again, unless we spend a lot of time doing this manually in Data Studio or whatever it might be, Power BI for your reporting, a lot of these tools don't necessarily tell us an awful lot about the actual nuts and bolts within the site. Think about this, for example, going back to SEO tools for Excel or Excel in general, we can look to export things like log files, indexation problems, href rankings, whatever it might be, into one unified place. Kudos for this guy for this particular template. And I think that's still really important in this day and age. Here's an example of what that looks like in visual form. As a process, it keeps you sharp. Perhaps the over-reliance on automated reports in SEO in 2021 does keep us removed and somewhat disjointed from the day-to-day data that we actually deal with, and that helps us inform our decisions. It may sound daunting, but perhaps staring at a spreadsheet or an Excel export of data, whatever it might be, for some period of time, we start to see things within that data that might help us inform our decisions better. It's about the processes and inspiration. And again, I'm not someone, as I said, who's mathematically minded or particularly has too much time or perhaps even the talent or knowledge to learn Python and automation. This works for me. This is just my opinion, big caveat, but I think there's some disadvantages and advantages for both things. At least it helped me perform my best ever season in fantasy football that year. Just look at that score and look at my kit. Isn't that so stylish? It's because I spent nothing else in lockdown apart from looking at these stats. And as I said, it was the highlight of my week, but it did pay dividends. So what next? Well, those reporting templates I showed you earlier are all housed in that Google Doc there at the top. Do have a look at that link and see if there's some way you could perhaps use them or integrate them into your day-to-day reporting, particularly if you're struggling with pulling metrics from different tools and you're getting frustrated with having to hash them out and into Excel sheets. Perhaps there's a solution there and there somewhere. At least you can go and change them as you see fit. I also wrote a blog post on these, contextualizing the story again. For those of you who want to hear my lockdown boredom in the written word, go check that out. I'll probably update that at some point. There's uptake and interest on this. And hey, depending on how 2021, 2022 goes, there was a point someone raised on LinkedIn about API pulling, that being using an API to automatically pull the stats in fantasy football and populate into a sheet. I know I've spoken in favor of manual reporting during the course of this deck, but hey, there could be something interesting there as well. Thanks for listening. Now, before I leave you, I'm going to finish on a slide that probably alienates half my audience, but perhaps remind us of a better, simpler, pre-COVID time to remind us that there were better things to do in life than spend our waking hours manually pulling fantasy football stats. At least it was a good time for me. Thank you so much.